Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, we're not diving into battles or queens with tragic love lives, or royal families that basically self-destructed through inbreeding. Though, don't worry, we'll circle back to that chaos another night. Tonight, we're going to do something very calming. Something that every human being across history has struggled with. And that is simply knowing what time it is. Now, you and I, we've got phones, digital watches, maybe even that one person who still proudly wears a pocket watch because they're committed to the aesthetic. But the truth is, for most of human history, timekeeping was, well, let's just say a vibe more than precise science. You'd wake up, look outside, and if the sun was doing its thing, you knew it was probably daytime. Revolutionary stuff. So tonight we're floating through history to see how ancient people, long before clocks, long before even medieval hourglasses, managed to measure and experience time. Spoiler, it involved a lot of staring at the sky, some questionable water contraptions, and more than one civilization that decided, close enough. So dim the lights, get cozy, maybe ignore that modern alarm clock next to your bed, and let's drift back thousands of years, when keeping time was a little more chaotic and honestly, way less stressful. Course. The most obvious place to start is the sky. Humans looked up, saw the giant fiery or moving slowly overhead, and thought, well, there's our clock. The sun was the original boss of timekeeping. You didn't argue with it. If it was rising, it was morning. If it was overhead, probably lunch. And if it was sinking, congratulations, you survived another day without being eaten by a lion. Now, early people didn't really measure time so much as they just kind of noticed it happening. The whole concept of hours, minutes, seconds, not a thing. You had when the sun comes up and when the sun goes down, which is honestly kind of freeing. Imagine a life where you never had to say, let's meet at 3:15 p.m. Instead, you just said, I'll see you when the shadows get long. Romantic or inconvenient. Depends who you ask. The Egyptians, decided to get fancy with it. They were some of the first to create what we'd call sundials. And if you're picturing a neat little garden sundial from your grandma's yard, nope. Early sundials were literally just a stick stuck in the ground, and you watch the shadow move. That's it. The shadow would creep along, and you get a rough sense of how far through the day you were. Not exactly Swiss engineering, but hey, it worked. But here's the problem. Sundials don't work at night, which is, kind of half the day. Imagine trying to set a bedtime routine, and the entire clock system just vanishes as soon as the sun goes down. People weren't thrilled about that. So civilization started getting creative. If the sun was a daytime clock, the moon and stars were the night shift. Ancient people noticed the moon's phases, waxing, waning, disappearing entirely, and they used it to count months. In fact, the word month literally comes from moon. A month was just one moon cycle. Easy math. But for shorter chunks of nighttime, that was trickier. Some societies, like the Babylonians, actually tracked star movements to break the night into smaller pieces. This meant there was probably some poor soul assigned to star duty, whose whole job was to stay awake and notice when a certain constellation popped up. Imagine explaining that as your career. Yeah, I'm the official star watcher. I just sit outside at 3 a.m. and squint a lot. Of course, this wasn't exactly precise. Clouds, storms, or falling asleep on the job could ruin the whole system. But people were trying. And honestly, that's the theme of early timekeeping. A lot of effort, questionable results. Then came one of humanity's first truly weird attempts at serious timekeeping, the water clock. Civilizations from Egypt to China to Greece came up with versions of this. The basic idea was simple. You take a container, poke a hole in it, and let water drip out at a steady pace. You'd mark the container, and as the water level dropped, you could tell how much time had passed. Sounds brilliant, right? Except water doesn't always flow consistently. Temperature changes, the water speeds up or slows down. A little debris in the hole, suddenly your clock is 2 hours fast. And heaven forbid the cat tips the thing over. Still, water clocks were everywhere for centuries. Judges in ancient Athens even used them to time speeches in court, which is wild. Imagine standing on trial, and your lawyer runs out of water time mid-sentence. Like, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, clearly my client is a nose. Glug, glug, glug. Oh, sorry, time's up. But hey, it was progress. Humanity had officially graduated from look at the sky to let's control time with plumbing. Meanwhile, over in China and later in medieval Europe, people figure out candles could be used to measure time too. You'd take a candle, mark it with lines, and as it burned down, you could track how many hours had passed. Simple, cheap, and it smelled nice if you used a fancy wax. But of course, there were problems. Different wax mixtures burned at different speeds. Drafts could ruin the accuracy, and sometimes candles just didn't burn evenly. Still, if you were a monk in a dark monastery trying to figure out how long you'd been chanting, a candle clock was your best friend. And let's be real, there's something poetically cozy about time literally melting away in candlelight. It's the most aesthetic of the ancient clocks that, so already, you can see. Keeping time before clocks was messy, imprecise, and often more symbolic than scientific. But it shaped daily life in ways we don't even think about anymore. Without minutes or seconds, life was slower, looser. People measured their days in meals, chores, and shadows. And yet, even without precision, people kept trying to tame time, to measure it, control it, make it predictable. Because deep down, humans are obsessed with order, even if that order is just counting drips of water in a clay pot. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. There are more odd, surprisingly creative methods people came up with to track the endless march of time. So where were we? Yes, people endlessly trying to figure out what time it was, and usually failing in delightful ways. The thing about ancient timekeeping is that it wasn't about precision. Nobody needed to know the difference between 4:07 and 4:12. The idea of a world obsessed with punctuality would have seemed bizarre. For most of history, being on time just meant showing up when everyone else did, and hoping the sun hadn't gone down yet. Take ancient Egypt again, for example. They were obsessed with the heavens, and for good reason. The Nile flooded according to cycles, and survival depended on predicting when it would happen. So, Egyptian priests used giant obelisks as cosmic timepieces. Tall stone spires, casting long shadows. In the morning, the shadow was on one side. In the afternoon, it swung around. Entire cities could look up and get a sense of the hour. It was public, communal, and honestly, kind of impressive. Though, of course, it only worked if you had sunshine. Cloudy day? Sorry, time has been canceled. The Babylonians, on the other hand, were determined to map out not just the day, but the night. They divided the day into 24 hours, a system we still use today. And it wasn't random. It was based on their love of the number 60. 60 was considered perfect, divisible by many numbers, clean, almost magical. So they carved up time accordingly. But this meant their hours weren't always consistent in length. Summer hours were longer, winter hours shorter. Imagine making plans and not even knowing if an hour meant 60 minutes or 45. It was fluid, seasonal, more art than science. Then, of course, there were the Greeks. They loved a gadget, and water clocks became their favorite toy. The Greek word for it was clepsydra, literally water thief, which is exactly what it did. It stole time one drip at a time. In Athens, if you were giving a speech in court, your time was measured not by a stopwatch, but by a clay pot with a hole in it. You'd hear the gentle trickle of water, and when the vessel emptied, that was it. No more talking. It's strange to imagine Socrates or Demosthenes standing there, watching their defense literally drip away. The Romans took the Greek clepsydra and ran with it, because Romans never met a Greek invention. They didn't want to appropriate and slap their name on. They used water clocks in military camps to keep night watches. The guards rotated in shifts, and instead of the sergeant barking, "Time's up," you just waited for the water to run out. Practical, yes, but you can imagine how many soldiers probably fudged the system. Maybe drilled an extra hole to get their shift over faster, or tilted the thing when nobody was looking. Human nature hasn't changed that much. Over in China, things were even more inventive. They came up with candle clocks, yes, but also incense clocks. These were strings of incense sticks, sometimes hundreds of them, designed to burn at steady rates. Some were elaborate, with tiny threads and bells tied along the length. So as the incense burned through, it would drop a bead or chime softly. Imagine lying in a quiet palace chamber, hearing faint pings as the hours passed, the smell of incense filling the air. That's timekeeping as aromatherapy. Very on brand for civilization that loved both bureaucracy and subtlety. Meanwhile, back in the monasteries of medieval Europe, monks were basically the unsung heroes of time. Their whole lives revolved around prayer at specific intervals, day and night. And since the sun was unreliable and water clocks tended to freeze in winter, they leaned heavily on candles. A thick, steady-burning candle could be marked in segments, maybe an inch for each hour. As it melted, monks knew when to rise, chant, or, more likely, keep chanting. I like to imagine some very tired monks sighing, watching wax drip down, thinking, why? Exactly. Did we commit to the schedule again? And yet, despite all of these contraptions, most people still didn't live by measured hours. Farmers rose with the sun, worked until it set, and slept when it was dark. The rhythm of the day was natural, not mechanical. If someone asked what time it was, the answer might be a little past sunrise, or after the second meal, or when the cattle come home. Nobody needed to synchronize their calendars with Swiss-level accuracy. The whole idea of stressing about being late simply wasn't part of life, which, honestly, sounds kind of nice. But humans can't leave well enough alone. They kept tinkering, adjusting, inventing. Time was a puzzle, and each civilization added another piece. Obelisks, stars, dripping water, burning wax, fragrant smoke. All of them imperfect. All of them fascinating. And through it all, people just kept living, working, and falling asleep without worrying about missing a Zoom call. And if you're already drifting a little right now, well, you're just syncing up with the slower, looser rhythms of the ancient world, which is exactly what we're here for tonight. The Egyptians, bless them, were absolute overachievers in this department. As if building pyramids wasn't enough, they wanted their temples to function like giant cosmic clocks. The priests would literally use the stars to track time during the night, mapping the rising and setting of certain constellations. They even developed what's sometimes called star clocks, with lists of which stars should appear at which part of the night. Imagine lying on your back in the desert, squinting at the sky and deciding, yes, clearly it's time for the midnight ritual, because that one slightly wobbly star over there just rose. It was beautiful, but let's be honest, wildly impractical if there were clouds. Or, sandstorms. Still, Egyptian priests managed to turn this into a schedule for their temple rituals. The gods apparently liked their offerings on time, and priests were basically human alarm clocks. Which raises a question. What happened if someone overslept? Did the god just frown slightly? Or maybe nothing happened at all, and the priests pretended they were perfectly on schedule anyway. We'll never know. Meanwhile, the Babylonians were gazing at the same skies and taking things to a whole new level of obsessive. These were the people who invented astrology, after all, so of course they couldn't just look at the stars casually. No, they mapped them meticulously, tracked lunar phases, and broke down time into mathematical units that still haunt us today. 60 minutes, 60 seconds, all thanks to them. You can thank a Babylonian scribe the next time you're staring at the clock. Realize that you've been trapped in a work meeting for exactly 47 minutes and 23 seconds. Without Babylon, you could have just shrugged and said, it feels like a while. The Greeks, naturally, decided they needed to refine everything. They liked precision, but mostly they liked looking clever while doing it. They took water clocks and started experimenting with gears, adding little tweaks so they could be more accurate. And because this was Greece, some of these contraptions got way too complicated. We're talking devices with tiny moving parts that probably broke constantly. There's even a famous Antikythera mechanism, a mysterious Greek gadget found in shipwreck, filled with gears that track celestial movements. It's sometimes called the world's first computer, which is impressive, but it also means some poor Greek sailor probably drowned while transporting what was basically an ancient clock that nobody could fix once it jammed. The Romans, never subtle, loved sundials. They scattered them all over their empire, in forums, markets, and villas. And because they were Romans, they also loved complaining about them. Writers from a period grumbled that sundials ruined everything by making life too structured. Before sundials, people just lived by natural rhythms. After sundials, Suddenly you could be late to things, which, honestly, feels very modern. The first person to mutter, "Ugh, I'm running late for my bath because of the stupid sundial," was probably Roman. And then there's China, where timekeeping reached new levels of artistry. Incense clocks, as I mentioned before, were stunningly intricate. Long sticks of incense burned at carefully calibrated rates, sometimes winding across elaborate carved dragons or towers. Certain points along the incense trail would drop metal balls onto gongs, creating soft chimes throughout the day or night. It wasn't just practical, it was aesthetic. Time became sensory, visible, audible, and fragrant. Imagine measuring your workday not with a digital beep, but with a gentle scent of sandalwood drifting through the air, punctuated by the occasional ding. Honestly, it sounds better than my phone alarm. Of course, accuracy was still, let's call it, flexible. But people weren't necessarily aiming for the kind of precision we demand today. What mattered was rhythm, ritual, and a sense of order. If the incense said it was midnight, then it was midnight, even if it was really closer to 11:30. Who was going to argue? Certainly not the emperor. And as these systems evolved, something subtle but important happened. Timekeeping became tied to power. Kings, emperors, priests all used their role as the keepers of time to reinforce authority. If you controlled the clocks or sundials or incense sticks, you controlled the rhythm of society. You decided when people prayed, when they worked, when they rested. Time itself became political, which, when you think about it, hasn't really changed. Governments still mess with our clocks twice a year with daylight savings, and we just grumble and accept it. A very ancient tradition in its own way. But even with all these clever tricks, the truth is simple. For most people, time was still felt more than measured. A farmer in Mesopotamia didn't care about star charts. He cared about whether the field was ready for planting. A fisherman in Egypt didn't track constellations. He noticed when the tide shifted. Time was communal, seasonal, and organic. The gadgets were fascinating, but they were mostly tools for elites, priests, and scholars. The average person lived in a world without clocks, without hours, and without the constant tick-tick-tick that we now take for granted, which makes me wonder, maybe they slept better. No alarm dragging them up at exactly 6:30 a.m., no late-night anxiety about being somewhere on time. Just sun, moon, and the occasional annoyed priest telling them they'd miss a ritual. In a way, it sounds like they had the right idea all along, that what's especially funny about all these early attempts at timekeeping is how often they just didn't work. Sundials are great until a cloud shows up. Water clocks are clever until winter hits and the water freezes. Candles are charming until a breeze blows through the monastery and suddenly 3 hours of your life just disappeared in a puff of smoke. And yet, instead of admitting defeat, people doubled down, as if the universe would eventually give in and behave. It never did, but humans are stubborn like that. In some cultures, they even build entire calendars around these imperfect systems, treating them as if they were reliable. The Mayans, for example, create incredibly complex calendars that didn't just track the solar year, but also layered in lunar cycles, ritual counts, and what we might call cosmic vibes. Time wasn't just about measuring hours. It was about syncing human life with divine patterns. Of course, this sometimes meant their predictions were more symbolic than practical. You might not know exactly when to meet your neighbor for goat trading, but you definitely know which day was cosmically auspicious to do it. Priorities. Meanwhile, the Persians had their own spin on time. They built water clocks so massive that they were used to allocate irrigation for farmers. Imagine a giant tank dripping away, determining exactly how long you were allowed to water your fields. Time literally equaled water, which in turn equaled life. Miss your slot? Tough luck. The clock doesn't lie, even if it's basically just a leaky bucket. It's a stark reminder that controlling time wasn't just about rituals or rituals. It was about resources. You can almost hear the arguments that must have broken out. The water clock was tilted. I swear I didn't use more than my share. Humans finding excuses, as usual, and let's not forget India, where astronomers were busy coming up with their own elaborate methods. Gnomons, basically giant sticks or towers used as sundials, were built on a massive scale. Some of them were so large they're still standing today, casting shadows that can measure time with surprising accuracy. But again, only if the sun felt like cooperating, which, if you've ever lived through a monsoon season, you know is not always guaranteed. Still, the effort speaks volumes about human persistence. We just couldn't stop ourselves from trying to make sense of the endless flow of hours. The real irony, though, is that despite all this effort, nobody was obsessed with punctuality the way we are. Time was approximate, flexible. If you told someone you'd meet them in the third hour, it didn't mean 2 p.m. sharp. It meant sometime in a rough neighborhood of mid-afternoon. A window, not a deadline. And if you didn't show up, well, people weren't happy, but they also weren't checking their pocket watches every 5 minutes. Because, of course, pocket watches didn't exist yet. It was a slower world, not just because technology was limited, but because expectations were different. It's easy to imagine an Egyptian farmer shrugging when asked what time it was. He'd probably gesture vaguely at the sky and say, about halfway to sunset. A Babylonian scholar might be a bit more precise, quoting lunar positions, but it was still more art than science. And a Roman? Well, a Roman probably looked at a sundial, complained it was off, and went back to the bathhouse anyway. That's about as punctual as they got. And yet, in their own imperfect ways, these early systems laid the groundwork for everything that came later. The idea that time could be measured, divided, and organized slowly seeped into cultures everywhere. Even if the tools were faulty, the concept stuck. People began to think in terms of hours and segments, not just sunrises and sunsets. And that shift changed everything. Work, religion, politics. They all began to orbit around these human-made rhythms. By the time we move forward into medieval Europe, the game will change again. Bells and monasteries will start to regulate daily life. Entire towns will be told when to wake, when to pray, and when to stop working. The mechanical clock is waiting just around the corner, ready to make life even more structured. But before we get there, it's worth pausing on this thought. For thousands of years, humans lived without knowing the exact time, and they managed just fine. They built empires, wrote epics, raised families, and fell asleep under the stars, none of them worrying about whether they were a quarter hour late. And that's kind of the beauty of this whole story. Ancient people tried, failed, tried again, and mostly accepted that time was bigger than them. Their clocks were leaky, smoky, wobbly, or cloudy, but life went on anyway. Maybe that's the lesson we can steal from them. Time doesn't always need to be exact. Sometimes it's enough to know the shadows are long. The candle is low, and it's probably time to rest. So we leave behind the ancients with their sundials, dripping water jars and half-melted candles, and float gently into medieval Europe. This is where things start to get a little noisier. Not because life itself was more hectic. Honestly, most people were just farming, arguing about land, or worrying about plague, but because bells began to take over the job of telling time. And let me tell you, monks were serious about their bells. Monasteries became the great timekeepers of the medieval world. Inside those stone walls, life revolved around prayer, work, and yes, more prayer. The monks divided their day into chunks called canonical hours. Matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, nun, vespers, and compline. If you're already yawning just hearing that list, good. It's doing its job. Each of these was a set time to pray, and each one was announced by a bell. Imagine being woken up at 2 a.m. because someone decided God wanted chanting right then. Peaceful, maybe. Convenient, not so much. But for the monks, bells weren't just noise. They were sacred. The ringing was meant to lift the soul toward heaven, to remind everyone of eternity, and also, let's be honest, to keep people on schedule. It's basically the medieval version of a calendar notification, except instead of soft phone vibration, you got a booming bell echoing through a stone tower at dawn. Romantic in theory, slightly annoying in practice. Of course, the townspeople living near monasteries weren't exactly free from the sonic system. Bells carried far, and soon towns adopted them for secular uses, too. Church towers started announcing not only prayer times, but also work hours, curfews, and warnings. If a bell rang at the wrong time, chaos could follow. People literally shaped their days around the sound. And let's be real. There's nothing like a sudden tolling at midnight to make everyone wonder the town's on fire, or if it's just another monk pulling the rope too enthusiastically. Now, If you're picturing medieval time as highly organized and precise, not quite. Even with bells, there was still plenty of wiggle room. A bell for noon might actually be rung a bit early if the monk in charge was hungry, or a bit late if he fell asleep. Clocks didn't rule yet. Humans still did. And humans, being human, were never perfectly punctual. But the cultural shift was real. People started expecting time to be told for them, not just guessed from the sky. This set the stage for one of the biggest inventions of the Middle Ages, the mechanical clock. And this wasn't just some tiny device sitting in your living room. No, the first ones were enormous, towering contraptions installed in cathedrals and town squares. Giant gears, swinging weights, and a whole lot of noise. Early mechanical clocks didn't even have faces or hands. They just rang bells at set intervals. It was less about telling you the exact minute and more about saying, "Hey, stop whatever you're doing. Something is happening now." The invention spread like wildfire. By the 14th century, major European cities competed to install the fanciest, loudest clocks in their towers. Prague, Strasbourg, Milan all wanted to outdo each other. Timekeeping had become a civic pride project. But again, these machines weren't perfectly accurate. They drifted, broke down, or chimed at slightly the wrong hour. Still, people marveled at them. Imagine walking into a medieval square, hearing this massive machine groan and clang, and realizing humanity had built something that could, sort of, mimic the steady rhythm of the heavens. It must have felt like magic. For ordinary people, though, life was still less about minutes and more about rhythms. Farmers worked from dawn to dusk. Craftsmen timed their days by light, and peasants mostly ignored the fancy clock towers unless the bells directly told them to move. The real impact of mechanical clocks was psychological. Time was no longer just natural. It was manufactured, measured, and enforced. And once humans realized they could build machines to track time, they never stopped at what a little amusing is how much resistance there was at first. Some folks genuinely didn't like the idea of their day being chopped into artificial hours. Philosophers worried that life was being made too rigid, too mechanical. And honestly, they weren't entirely wrong. The clocks slowly took power away from nature. No more watching the sun or listening for the rooster. Instead, people listened to iron gears, bronze bells, and the occasional grumpy monk who swore the bell rang on time, even if everyone else thought it didn't. And yet, despite complaints, the march of mechanical time continued. Cities relied on it, governments relied on it, and before long, even trade relied on it. Merchants could agree to meet at a certain bell strike. Travelers could time departures. Armies could coordinate maneuvers. Sure, the bells might still be off by 15 minutes, but that was better than waiting for the sun to peek through the clouds. Progress medieval style. And just as the bells had once ruled monasteries, they soon ruled everyone else's lives. Waking, working, eating, resting, all became tied to the ticking of man-made machines. Not perfectly, not uniformly, but enough that people began to sense a new truth. Time wasn't just flowing naturally anymore. It was being captured, sliced, controlled. The irony is that while all this was happening, the vast majority of people probably didn't own a single device for personal timekeeping. No wristwatches, no pocket watches, nothing. If you wanted to know the time, you either looked at the sky, listened for bell, or maybe asked a neighbor who'd been paying closer attention. Life was still fundamentally imprecise, but the seeds of modern punctuality had been planted at S.O. after medieval towns got their giant noisy clock towers and monks had thoroughly proven that sleep schedules were overrated. Humanity entered the Renaissance. This was the age of art, science, and, apparently, showing off your wealth by strapping bits of ticking metal to yourself. Because nothing says sophistication like, "Look, I own a tiny machine that tells me I'm late." The Renaissance loved precision, or at least the idea of precision. Astronomers were charting the skies, merchants were expanding trade routes, and navigators were crossing oceans. And all of them had one problem. You can't exactly steer a ship across the Atlantic by glancing at a cathedral bell tower. That's where portable timekeeping started to matter. Enter the mechanical clock's little cousin, the pocket watch. Around the 15th and 16th centuries, clever craftsmen in places like Nuremberg began making these miniaturized clocks that wealthy men could carry around. They were big, clunky, and about as accurate as a sleepy rooster, but they looked expensive, which, honestly, was the main point. Accuracy could come later. First, people wanted status. Imagine a Renaissance noble showing off his new watch at a banquet. Behold, I can almost tell you the hour. Of course, the thing might lose 30 minutes a day, but who was checking? It wasn't like peasants had their own devices to call him out. Plus, you could always blame the sun for being in the wrong place. That was a convenient excuse. Now, as technology improved, watches became slightly less terrible. By the 17th century, watchmakers were adding balance springs, which meant the devices could keep time more steadily. Suddenly, owning a watch wasn't just about flexing wealth. It was genuinely useful. Merchants could coordinate trade more reliably. Scientists could measure experiments with more precision. Navigators could at least pretend they weren't hopelessly lost. And here's the fun part. Personal watches started reshaping daily life. Before, time had been a public thing. Bells ringing in the town square, monks chanting at random hours, giant clocks clanging above everyone's heads. But now, time slipped into people's pockets. It became private, individual. Suddenly, you didn't have to wait for a bell tower to tell you what hour it was. You could discreetly check your own little gadget. That might sound normal to us now, but back then, it was revolutionary. It's the same energy as going from communal landlines to everyone having their own smartphones. Of course, watches weren't exactly widespread at first. They were luxury items. Regular folks, farmers, craftsmen, the majority of Europe, still lived by sunlight, weather, and routine. Wake up when it's light, work until you can't see, go to bed before you trip over furniture. But in cities, among the elites, watches became a symbol of modernity. If the Middle Ages belonged to the bell towers, the Renaissance was when time started to go mobile. And then there were the inventors who just couldn't resist making things extra. Renaissance clockmakers didn't stop at simple watches. Oh no, they built astronomical clocks that tracked the movement of planets, the phases of the moon, even zodiac signs. You could walk into a city square and see a clock that not only told you the hour, but also reassured you that Mercury was still being weird and retrograde. Because apparently, one set of hands on a dial wasn't enough. You needed 6. Some clocks became full-blown tourist attractions. The Prague astronomical clock, for example, didn't just tell time. It had moving figures of apostles, skeletons, and symbolic animals popping out every hour. Basically, it was a medieval version of a theme park animatronic show. People gathered in crowds to watch wooden figures shuffle around for 30 seconds and then went home satisfied. Simpler times, quite literally. But beneath all this spectacle was something deeper. The growing obsession with measuring time more accurately. Scientists realized that if you could measure time precisely, you could understand the universe better. Galileo famously studied pendulums and realized they could regulate clocks far more consistently than clunky weights. And so the pendulum clock was born, making timekeeping suddenly much sharper. The pendulum clock changed everything. Now, you could actually trust that an hour was an hour. No more guessing whether the sun was slightly crooked or if the monk overslept. Pendulum swung reliably, tick by tick, in a way that felt almost hypnotic. It was mechanical rhythm turned into a heartbeat for society. And once again, society adapted. Cities could regulate markets better. Scientists could time experiments. Navigators could chart courses with more confidence. Even ordinary households started buying clocks, setting them up on mantels, and letting the steady tick-tock become part of daily life. Time was no longer just a vague background thing. It was creeping into homes, shaping routines, and reminding everyone that life was, in fact, moving along a course. Let's not over-romanticize it. These early clocks were still expensive, and they still needed constant winding, oiling, and tinkering. If you forgot to wind it one night, well, congratulations, your household just slipped back into timeless chaos until you fixed it. But the symbolism mattered. Timekeeping was no longer just for churches and kings. It was becoming something ordinary people aspired to own, to control, to live by. And yet, even with all this progress, people were still hilariously bad at punctuality. Just because you had a clock didn't mean you suddenly cared about being on time. Diaries from the period are full of complaints about people showing up late to meetings, ignoring schedules, or blaming their watch for being off. In other words, the invention of personal time didn't magically fix human nature. People remained, well, people. So by the late Renaissance and into the early modern era, the stage was set. Time was shrinking down, becoming personal, creeping into pockets and parlors. Accuracy was improving, but the real transformation, the one that would finally turn time into the rigid, relentless master of our lives, was yet to come. And it arrived, as most things do, with the Industrial Revolution. By the late 18th century, clocks had already wormed their way into homes, towns, and pockets. But society was still flexible about time. Farmers followed the rhythm of the land. Sailors followed the stars, and most people still treated hours as polite suggestions. That easy rhythm was about to be crushed, politely of course, by factories, whistles, and steam. The Industrial Revolution took one look at time and said, "You're mine now." Machines needed people to show up on schedule. Coal-powered engines didn't care if you overslept or if the rooster forgot to crow. If you were late, the factory kept grinding without you, or worse, you got replaced. Suddenly, punctuality wasn't just nice. It was survival. Factory owners quickly realized they had a problem. Workers had lived for centuries without caring about precise hours. So how do you retrain an entire population to suddenly worship the clock? The answer was bells, whistles, and a whole lot of scolding. Factories installed giant clocks, rang bells at starting time, and blew whistles to mark breaks and endings. Some even hired foremen whose job was basically to nag workers into punctuality. The concept of the work shift was born and people hated it. Imagine you're a 19th century weaver. You've spent your life working by daylight. Now, suddenly, you're expected to show up at 6 a.m. sharp, or the big clock will rat you out. And that machine will keep thundering along whether you're there or not. Time went from something you lived alongside to something that ruled you, a tyrant in ticking form. Railroads cranked up the pressure even further. Before trains, towns set their clocks however they liked. Noon was when the sun hit its peak, which meant every town's noon was slightly different. That was fine when your fastest travel option was a horse. But with trains, being a few minutes off could cause chaos or collisions. So railroads demanded standardization. They wanted time zones, coordinated schedules. No more sleepy little towns deciding they were 12 minutes ahead just because the mayor liked it that way. By the mid-19th century, railway time began spreading. People grumbled, of course. Imagine being told that the time you've always known is suddenly wrong because a train company says so. But the system stuck, and eventually it became official. In 1884, an international conference carved the world into time zones like a giant grid, all anchored around Greenwich, England. Suddenly, the sun wasn't in charge of your day anymore. The clock was. And honestly, the sun never recovered from the insult. With railroads and factories enforcing the clock, ordinary life changed too. Shops opened at set hours. Schools began ringing bells for classes. Families bought cheap alarm clocks, which became some of the most dreaded objects in history. If you've ever wanted to throw your alarm against a wall, congratulations. You share a spiritual connection with millions of 19th century workers. Now, one of the more depressing things about this new clock-centered world was how it reshaped people's sense of self. Before, you were a farmer, a baker, or a shepherd, and your work flexed with the seasons and sunlight. After the Industrial Revolution, you became a shift worker. Your life was chopped into hours. Your value measured in time units. You were no longer just you. You were you from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. with a 30-minute lunch. Romantic, isn't it? Of course. Humans being humans, they found ways to resist. Workers slowed down, took long breaks, or simply ignored the clock whenever they could. Labor unions began forming, often demanding shorter working hours. The 8-hour workday didn't appear magically. It was fought for, often with strikes and protests. The slogan was simple: 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, 8 hours for what we will, which was a poetic way of saying, we're tired, please let us go home. And while the factory floor was all about time discipline, the middle and upper classes used clocks for another purpose: social bragging. Wealthy Victorians filled their parlors with ornate mantel clocks, grandfather clocks, and pocket watches that looked like they belonged in a jewelry case. Timepieces became status symbols. You weren't just telling the time, you were showing off your taste and money. Some watches were engraved with family crests or even decorated with jewels, as if punctuality itself needed accessorizing. Meanwhile, scientists and inventors weren't done tinkering. They wanted even greater accuracy. Pendulums were fine, but what about astronomy? In cities, observatories began sending out official time signals. Some even dropped giant balls from towers at noon so ships in the harbor could set their clocks. Eventually, telegraphs carried standardized time across continents. By the end of the 19th century, time wasn't just local. It was global, coordinated, relentless. Let's pause here for a cozy little irony. The more humans obsessed over controlling time, the more they realized how slippery it was. No matter how many clocks they built, people still showed up late. Machines broke down. Schedules got scrambled. Even the most precise watch couldn't stop the feeling that time was somehow slipping through your fingers. It's a bit comforting, really. Despite all the whistles, bells, and rules, time still belonged partly to chaos. By the dawn of the 20th century, however, society had largely surrendered to the tick-tock. Time zones were official. Factories ran like machines. Cities moved in hourly pulses. And while people might have missed the slower rhythms of daylight, there was no going back. Humanity had strapped itself to the clock, and the clock wasn't letting go. By the time the 20th century rolled in, humanity was completely under the spell of the clock. We were punching in at factories, catching trains, setting alarms, and living in neat little block of hours. But apparently that wasn't enough, because the 20th century looked at clocks and said, "Cool toy, but can it be more precise?" And so began an arms race for accuracy that still hasn't stopped. The big breakthrough came with quartz clocks. Discovered in the 1920s, quartz crystals had this neat property where they vibrated at a steady frequency when electrified. That vibration could be turned into timekeeping. Unlike pendulums, which could be thrown off by humidity, gravity, or your cousin bumping into the table, quartz kept ticking at a steady pace no matter what. By the mid-20th century, quartz watches were everywhere, quietly making pocket watches and old wind-ups look like antiques. And then, because humans are never satisfied, scientists decided even quartz wasn't good enough. Enter the atomic clock. Developed in 1949, it measured time using the vibrations of atoms, usually cesium. The accuracy was absurd. We're talking a clock so steady it wouldn't lose a single second in millions of years. Because apparently, someone out there was late for work and said, "If only I had an atom." Atomic clocks quickly became the backbone of modern life. They controlled radio signals, guided airplanes, and eventually kept satellites in sync. By the 1960s, they were so influential that the world literally redefined a second around them. No more basing seconds on the Earth's rotation. Nope, the planet was wobbly and unreliable. Instead, scientists said, 1 second equals 9,192,631,770 vibrations of a cesium atom, which is hilarious because it means the entire concept of a second is basically humanity counting really tiny wobbles of space dust. While the labs were busy measuring atoms, ordinary people were being introduced to the wristwatch revolution. During World War I, soldiers found that digging around for a pocket watch in the middle of battle wasn't exactly convenient, so they strapped them to their wrists. After the war, wristwatches became fashionable for everyone. By mid-century, if you didn't have a watch, you were basically walking around naked, at least socially speaking. The Cold War era cranked things up further. Space exploration demanded timing so precise that even a sneeze could throw off a launch. Satellites needed to be synchronized to the microsecond. GPS wouldn't even exist without atomic clocks quietly ticking inside satellites, whispering down signals that tell your phone where you are, which means every time you use Google Maps, you're relying on vibrating atoms in space. Weird, right? Meanwhile, culture started obsessing over time in a new way: productivity. The 20th century wasn't just about measuring seconds. It was about using them. Time is money stopped being a cliche and started being a way of life. Businesses introduced time management systems. Stopwatches were used to break jobs into measurable chunks, and workers were trained to squeeze more output into each minute. Efficiency became a religion. People weren't just late anymore, they were wasting time, which is possibly the saddest phrase humans ever invented. By the 1970s and 80s, digital clocks flooded the world. Suddenly, you didn't need to squint at little hands and numbers. Time flashed at you in glowing red digits, precise to the second, impossible to ignore. And with that came alarm clocks that beeped like angry robots, watches with calculators built in, and, most terrifying of all, the microwave clock. Entire generations spent their childhood staring at a blinking 12 o'clock because nobody in the house knew how to set it. But perhaps the most profound shift was psychological. For the first time in history, humans were surrounded by time displays everywhere, glowing digits on ovens, cars, televisions, bedside tables. You couldn't escape. Time was no longer a background rhythm. It was constantly screaming in your face. 7:32, 7:33. You're late. You're always late. And yet, ironically, while people became more obsessed with punctuality, they also became more anxious about it. Stress, burnout, and time anxiety skyrocketed. Being on time wasn't enough. Now you had to be efficient, productive, optimized. If the medieval farmer lived by the seasons, the modern office worker lived by the deadline. Both exhausting, but in very different ways. Of course, some people rebelled. The hippie movement in the 1960s famously rejected clock time and embraced a more natural rhythm. Spiritual communities talked about living beyond time. But despite the rebellion, the digital beeps of the clock always won. Because at the end of the day, even the freest spirit still had to catch a bus. The 21st century arrived, and with it came the ultimate shift. Time wasn't just something you wore on your wrist or glanced at on the wall anymore. No, now it lived in your pocket, glowing at you every time you pulled out your phone. The smartphone basically turned into humanity's collective clock. It was accurate, synchronized the satellites, and of course, it never shut up. Suddenly, you didn't need to wonder what time it was. You didn't even need to ask someone else. The answer was already buzzing in your hand, blinking on your screen, and probably reminding you that you were 5 minutes late for a Zoom call. Time stopped being a thing you checked. It became a thing that constantly checked you. Phones weren't alone in this obsession. Computers had already been relying on synchronized clocks for decades. The internet itself runs on coordinated timing, down to milliseconds. If the world's servers were even slightly out of sync, websites would crash, transactions would fail, and basically all of modern civilization would trip over itself. Which is funny to think about. Entire economies, social media platforms, and dating apps are balanced on a handful of atomic clocks ticking away in labs, all so your cat video can load smoothly. Of course, now that time is everywhere, humans are even worse at relaxing around it. There's this odd thing psychologists call time anxiety. It's the sense that we never have enough hours, that we're always running behind, and that time is sprinting past us while we're stuck answering emails. In other words, the clock isn't just a tool anymore. It's a stress monster. Ironically, we've circled all the way back to something ancient. People thousands of years ago marked time with the rising sun or the dripping of water. It was natural, slow, and perfect. Today, we have phones screaming atomic precision at us, but it doesn't feel all that different from standing in a field, squinting at shadows, and realizing the day is slipping away. The technology changed, but the worry stayed the same. And let's not forget the weird modern habit of obsessing over being on time in a world where, realistically, we could all just chill. Your great-great-grandparents didn't worry about whether they were 2 minutes late for a meeting. They were worried about whether the cow had wandered off again. But today, being 120 seconds late to a coffee date feels like a crisis. Progress, apparently. Then came smartwatches because apparently it wasn't enough to have the clock in your pocket. Now it had to be strapped directly to your bloodstream. These little glowing rectangles buzz on your wrist every time an email shows up, every time your heart rate shifts, and of course, every time you dare to forget that time was still ticking away. One could argue they're less about telling the time and more about reminding you how little of it you have. At the same time, The world is now juggling multiple time zones, all thanks to the globalization of work and the internet. Medieval peasants never had to worry about whether it was 3 p.m. in Tokyo or 7 a.m. in London. But now, millions of people wake up for meetings scheduled in someone else's daylight. Coordinated Universal Time, UTC, quietly runs the show, keeping planes flying, stock markets ticking, and your email server in sync. UTC is basically the invisible boss of the modern age. But perhaps the most surreal shift of all is how casual we become with time now that everything's recorded. Missed a meeting? It's fine. Zoom will email you the replay. Forgot the exact time of a call? Don't worry, your phone logged it. Couldn't remember when you sent that message? Scroll up, it's stamped forever. For a species once obsessed with sundials and church bells, we now exist in a reality where time is archived, replayable, and weirdly flexible, yet somehow more stressful than ever. And here's the kicker. After thousands of years of building this intricate cage of clocks, alarms, and schedules, humans are increasingly looking for ways to escape it. Meditation apps tell you to live in the moment. Wellness gurus say to ignore the clock and just be. People dream of vacations where the phone is turned off and the watch is left at home. It's almost like we spent millennia perfecting the measurement of time, only to realize that the thing we really want is to stop caring. The future of timekeeping is a bit of a paradox. On one hand, humanity keeps trying to measure it more precisely. On the other, there's a growing desire to escape it altogether. It's like we're torn between building atomic clocks that can keep perfect time for millions of years and simultaneously downloading meditation apps that remind us to just breathe. Right now, the cutting edge of time isn't your wristwatch or your phone. It's in giant laboratories where physicists are tinkering with atomic clocks so sensitive they can measure time dilation. Yes, the same time dilation from Einstein's relativity, where time itself bends depending on gravity and speed. These clocks can detect the difference in time between your head and your feet, just because your feet are slightly closer to the Earth's gravity. Imagine explaining that to a medieval monk ringing the bell tower. But here's the sleepy irony. The more precise our clocks get, the less useful they feel to everyday life. Knowing the exact nanosecond doesn't help you when your bus is late or your dinner burns. It just shows how strange it is that we push time to such extremes, when really most of us just want to know if it's bedtime yet. Some futurists even suggest that one day, our lives won't be dictated by clocks at all. Instead, everything will be automated. Alarms replaced by smart homes gently adjusting the light in your room. Meals arriving exactly when your body needs them. Schedules personalized by artificial intelligence. Time, in a way, would fade into the background, invisible, handled for us. We just float from one activity to the next, guided not by ticking clocks, but by algorithms quietly making sure everything syncs. Basically, the clock would still rule us, but it would whisper instead of shout. Then again, there's the opposite vision. As life gets faster, people might rebel by going timeless. Whole communities are already experimenting with this, like retreats where you give up your phone, cover the clocks, and just live by natural rhythms. No alarms, no schedules, just eating when you're hungry, sleeping when you're tired, and existing in what's basically a prehistoric loop, which, ironically, is where this entire story started, so maybe the future is a strange mix of both. Hyper-precise atomic clocks humming away in labs to keep planes in the sky and satellites aligned. And at the same time, humans lie in hammocks, deliberately ignoring the hour, deciding that maybe it's okay to live like cavemen again, only with Wi-Fi. And if you zoom all the way out, it's almost funny. For thousands of years, we built sundials, water clocks, hourglasses, pendulums, and atomic tickers, all to slice time thinner and thinner. Yet in the end, the one thing everyone seems to crave is what the ancients already had, the simple comfort of not knowing the hour. So, when you close your eyes tonight and let yourself drift, just remember, time has always been there, keeping its quiet count. From shadows on the ground to satellites in space, it's never stopped. But you don't have to follow every tick. You can let it slide by, like sand through an hourglass you forgot to flip. So here we are, after wandering through sundials, candle clocks, incense sticks, water drips, and finally atomic pulses. From cavemen watching the shadows stretch across the dirt, to physicists staring at lasers so steady, They make the universe itself look like it's keeping a schedule. The journey of timekeeping is, oddly enough, one of the longest-running obsessions humans have ever had. And through it all, there's been the same thread. Nobody's ever really been satisfied with the clock they've got. The sundial worked until it didn't. The water clock seemed brilliant until it froze in winter. The hourglass was clever, but it ran out of sand at the worst possible moment. Even the first mechanical clocks ticked so loudly they drove monks half insane during midnight prayers. And here we are today, with atomic clocks that can keep time for billions of years, and yet most of us still show up late to meetings. The truth is, we don't chase clocks because we love them. We chase them because we're just a little afraid of time itself. Afraid of missing something. Afraid of wasting it. Afraid it might slip away faster than we can catch it. And yet, ironically, the one time we're happiest is when we stop paying attention to it at all. That's why bedtime stories about history work so well. You don't need to know the exact hour the Egyptians invented their sundials, or the precise year mechanical escapements first chimed over medieval towns. What matters is the drift, the slow slide of one century into the next. The way the same questions keep coming back. How do we measure time? How do we control it? And do we ever really succeed? So maybe the answer isn't in the clocks at all. Maybe the real comfort is in realizing that time moves at the same pace whether you measure it or not. A Roman farmer watching the sunset was living by the same rhythm as you are tonight, lying here with your eyes heavy, listening to history stretch out like a soft, endless line. And if you let go of the counting, the measuring, the ticking, you might find what ancient people always knew. That night comes whether you watch the stars or not. That sleep arrives without a schedule. That tomorrow will be waiting, no matter how many bells or alarms try to drag it forward. So here's your final reminder. You don't need to hold on to the hours. You don't need to chase them. You can just let them go. Like the drip of a forgotten water clock. Like the shadow of a sundial fading into dusk. Like sand that never stops flowing, whether you watch or not. And with that, our little story of clocks and timekeeping can gently close its eyes. The past is still there, ticking quietly in the background. But you don't have to. You can rest now while time keeps itself. Good night.